In my last video about Ethan and Ela Klein, I mentioned that an episode of the H3 podcast can potentially bring in upwards of $100,000 per episode. While I didn't personally think that that was a controversial statement anyway, a lot of people in the comments section were calling me out, saying that I was absolutely wrong with my assessment of how much an episode of their podcast can make. But I disagree still, and I will explain my math today on how much an episode of the H3 podcast can potentially bring in. While I didn't explain all of my math in the last video about how I got that number, I think today it would actually make a very good video to explain how a show like the H3 podcast has so many different revenue streams to take from that they can make a lot of money off it. To begin this math, let's first take a look at the platform the podcast airs live on, Twitch. I actually talked to a YouTuber that I know who's on Twitch quite often, and he gave me some insight on what they're pulling in there. And these are the numbers he told me. Because the channel has 48 emotes, that means that they must have reached at least 6,200 subscribers. And the minimum he would have made off each of those people is $2.50 a month. That math comes out to $15,500. And if we divide that number by the number of podcasts each month, which is around 4, that's $3,875 per podcast. When asking about how much they made off ad revenue per show, that was a little bit more unclear. But my contacts said that $1,000 per episode would be a very reasonable assessment for a show of their size. Moving on to YouTube, when the show is uploaded there in its entirety, they often get 1 million views an episode. Sometimes more, sometimes less, but I'm just rounding to a middle range. Because the episodes are long, it will help increase the CPM of the video, which essentially is the amount of money made per 1,000 views. Assuming that they make a very conservative $2.50 CPM for the episode, that comes out to another $2,500 added to the total. But we haven't even gotten to the real money maker. Sponsored messages. These are the little ads for companies and products that they read during an episode, and the company that they mainly get them from charges a $25 CPM for ad reads on the podcast. So assuming that they charge based off 1 million viewers, which seems about right when you include audio-only streams and downloads of the episode, that means that they make $25,000 for one of them. The thing is, since their show is so popular and a lot of companies want to be promoted to their audience, they sometimes get 4 ad reads an episode, meaning that the sponsored messages pull in $100,000. Even if you account for the ad agency taking, let's say, a 20% commission, that's still $80,000 right there. Next up, we have the podcast highlight channel, which breaks up their videos into smaller bite-sized pieces. While it fluctuates, using the Bobby Lee episode as an example, all clips together brought in around 1.4 million views. Using a $2 CPM for these videos, that would mean they made $2,800 right there. Finally, let's get into their most recent venture, live shows. To be fair, I don't know much about the profitability here. But in one of their more recent episodes, they mentioned that they seem pretty confident in filling up a 1,500-seat show. If they were able to do that and hypothetically make a $10 cut off each of the tickets sold, that would be another $15,000. So with all these revenue streams added together, we roughly have over $105,000 for a single episode. Or as I said in the original video, upwards of $100,000, which was in fact correct. As I also mentioned in the previous video, which a lot of people like to ignore, was that I purposely used an extreme example to prove a point. Even on a bad day, however, though, they're probably still making $50,000 for a podcast, which is good money. I think the main reason a lot of people question my $100,000 number is because they don't see Ethan and Ela as rich people. But if you watch enough of their podcasts like I do, the signs do show. They recently mentioned that they upgraded to a new house in Los Angeles, one of the most expensive real estate markets in the country, and on top of that, they purchased the Tesla Model S, which is a car that costs upwards of $125,000. Just because a lot of YouTubers aren't like Rice Gum where they wear super expensive designer clothing and drive around in supercars, does not mean that people are not making a lot of money on this website. They simply have no benefit in bragging about their wealth to their audience, because if they turn around and try to sell them a book later on, people may feel more of a need to torrent it because they think, oh, those people are already making a ton of money. Why do I need to pay for this? On top of the H3 podcast, however, Ethan and Hila do have other big revenue streams as well, such as the Teddy Fresh clothing line where pieces of clothing often sell out immediately, and then they have their regular merch store, and also don't forget the H3H3 channel, which I'm sure still brings in hundreds of thousands of dollars a year, even after the adpocalypse. I can confidently say that Ethan and Hila are millionaires, and you know what? There's nothing wrong with that. They've worked hard for where they're at. Hey everybody, and thank you so much for making it to the end of this video today. It's really appreciated. As for the question of the day, the Odd Ones Out actually wants to know, what's my favorite movie that's below a 5-star rating on the Internet Movie Database? And that's actually a really tough question because a movie has to usually be extremely terrible to get below 5 stars on there. I was originally going to pick Good Burger since that's a movie that I do unironically enjoy. But after going onto the Internet Movie Database, I realized that that in fact has above a 5-star rating, so I'm out of ideas. The best I can do is point out So Bad It's Good movies that I enjoy ironically because the people that made them failed miserably and it ended up being hilarious. At the top of that list for me would be Troll 2. Troll 2 is probably a movie that I've watched more than any other film in my life. Every single time I watch it, there's a new little nuance to the performances that I get a kick out of because it's just so outrageous. The dialogue is so terrible. It was written by people that didn't even speak English as a first language, so they didn't even quite understand how teenagers in America spoke in the 80s. So it just came out to be this terrible project altogether, and it's one of my favorite films, even though it's really terrible. So that is the answer to your question, Odd Ones Out. I'm sorry that I wasn't able to pick something that was an unironic choice, but that's the best I got, and I'll end the video here. So until next time, thanks for watching. L'amour, l'amour t'adore.